everybody. Now that we're all awake and had our Red Bull, how's everyone enjoying Siege tonight? Happy Siege Saturday. Excellent. Everyone enjoy the Hi-Rez Studio networking lunch? Yeah. All right. Everybody meet somebody new at the networking lunch? Excellent. All right. Love having everyone out here. When we were trying to figure out our Saturday night keynote, we had a problem we don't usually have in that we had way too many options. So what do? We put them all up together. Exactly. I'm very excited about this session, and I'm very excited about what we've been doing with Siege all through. This is a perfect example of the theme for this weekend, Survive and Thrive. All of these individuals have been involved in the industry now for 1 or 2 years and have gone through a lot of the issues that all of you just starting now will end up going through. So the advice you're about here is invaluable. The insights are from a variety of different perspectives. But all of these individuals have shown a great ability to thrive in a very interesting, ever-changing, never-constant environment. And with that said, I'm very happy to turn this over to the IGDA, the International Game Developer Association's General Counsel, a good friend out of North Carolina, Brandon Huffman.
All right, so, it really doesn't work very well, does it? Wow, that's, okay, so lean in, everybody. Good advice for all of you, too. Lean in to your careers and everything else, right? Read the book. So as he said, I'm Brandon Huffman. I'm General Counsel to the International Game Developers Association. I'm based in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I also have a law firm that focuses on representing corporate intellectual property clients in games and interactive media. Typically, small to mid-sized game studios make up most of the client base. I'll let each of the panelists do their own introduction as we move along, but first I just wanted to say the title of this panel is Not a Boss Battle, Business and Legal Challenges. So we're going to talk about those challenges, but the important thing here is a lot of what we're going to say is going to sound really scary. It's not, right? Everybody on this stage, if they say that, we faced this situation or we did this thing, they're still here, right? Like they made it through that thing. So it's not the boss battle. It's just another fight in the series of fights you're going to have while you build your studio or build your career. So with that, I'll let James introduce himself and we'll run down the line.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm James Portnow. I've been a game designer for 10 years now, mostly working in the AAA field. I run a design consulting firm, and I run a YouTube channel called Extra Credits.
I am completely dwarfed by the people around me. My name's Molly Profit.
That's not true.
My name's Molly Profit. I run a game studio called Ker-Chunk Games in Norcross, Georgia. That's Leah. She is my co-founder. We've been making games under our own company since 2014. Before that, I did a lot of advert games, so a lot of B2B agency type work where we had to make games for other people. And we still do that, but we also make original IPs as well. And I also made a Barbie at one point, and I don't want to talk about it anymore.
Nice. I am Nathaniel Blair. I'm General Counsel at Hi-Rez Studios and Skillshot Media. So as General Counsel, essentially the legal officer or attorney for Hi-Rez and for Skillshot. Skillshot is our esports production company. So dealing with a lot of things, both on the video game studio side, the publisher side, the esports side, and before that I was at a large law firm and I was doing a mix of financial institution work and sports law.
All right, so I think the first challenge most studios face is figuring out how to find money. So I think, Nate, you probably don't have as strong an opinion about this, so I'll direct this one maybe to James and Molly first. So the question is really, where do you find money?
Wherever you can. So I think before you even get to that question, I think one of the things that a lot of studios don't think about enough is how much money do you need, right? Very often people go into games, especially when they're starting up their first studio, with this very pie in the sky, this is my dream game that I've always wanted to build. And realistically, it's going to cost $100 million, and you're not going to raise $100 million unless you've had a long time in the industry and a lot of people who are very notable working with you. Especially if you're a designer, your job is not to create the best imaginable game. Your job is to create the best possible game. And there have been plenty of games that are an hour or even 6 minutes that are very successful. So the first thing I would think about is how much money do you actually need? And then once you have that, you can figure out if that's a Kickstarter, if that's an angel investor, a VC, if that's a publisher, if it's doing some side gigs to sort of earn that money. Shocking. I would actually not recommend that route. Or if you can just put in the money yourself, either by living in your mom's basement and eating ramen until you get it done, or by actually putting in the money yourself. Yes, many of us have started in exactly that place. So yeah, I guess that's my thoughts.
I'm in disagreement on the side gigs.
All right.
I totally would not do it if that was an option. But the reality of it is if you want to build something, you probably have to fund it yourself, especially if you aren't on the original WoW team, right? Or you don't have the reputation to be able to go to an angel. And angels in Atlanta really aren't looking at investing in games right now, unless you're doing like games for health. So original IP, if you want to make it, you're going to have to fund it yourself. Now you can take side gigs and charge your market value or your market worth, and then build up a war chest to fund your original IP, but it is very, very hard. And yeah, avoid it if you can.
No, I think that's actually great. And I totally understand. So the only reason that I didn't recommend it, and maybe you can give some advice on how to avoid this, because it sounds like you guys are successful at it. I've seen a lot of studios where they say, oh, we're going to take some side gigs, we're going to take some advert gigs, we're going to build up that war chest, and then we're going to launch our game. And they actually just get stuck in this perpetual cycle of the side gigs only, because you can never quite make enough margin to actually get to your game. So how do you avoid that?
You have to not pay yourself enough. That's like literally, like, no, seriously. Like, if you're like, I want to make $75,000 a year, I want to make $90K a year, the only way is to sacrifice to do that. Like, I mean, or unless people actually want to pay you $200 an hour. Like,
I totally understand. The first year that I did my design consulting firm, I made $10,000 the entire year. Yeah.
Yeah, so that actually brings up a good question, which is how do you budget and what do you prioritize when you're in that early stage? What do you think is the most important thing to spend money on instead of sweat equity?
I'm just kidding. The most important things. People.
Yeah.
Like we're finally able to hire one freaking person this year. I'm serious. We're super tiny. We call ourselves a boutique shop. But we'll do like co-development deals. So if we need like extra programmers on a project, that's our other model. That's another model that we see kind of in. It's not this typical publisher developer model. It's like two companies who have their own studios are trying to come together and figure out a way to do that. Now I know it's really scary because you can't do like the perfect 50-50 split. But yeah, it's interesting time right now to try to get these small studios to build products together.
Yeah, no, I actually totally agree with you. My only addition to that is just make sure it's the right person. Sometimes there's this, you'll get a bigger client and you'll need to add somebody right away, or you'll just have some spare money and be like, oh, we can finally hire somebody. But take that step back, take that little bit of extra time, because it's hard to let people go, and the wrong person can really derail your studio, especially when you're a small team. So just make sure when you're hiring people in that you're hiring the right people.
And pay your lawyer first.
Thanks, Mom.
Always pay your lawyer first. No, actually, one other thing I will throw more seriously. I completely agree with you, Molly. I think very early on you're going to wind up needing to essentially, postpone your own salary. You're not paying yourself when you're starting that company. But I think you should also bear in mind that if you can find those right people, one of the best things you can do is you can make them owners of your company too, right? And yes, you are giving away some of your equity, but at the same time, you're spreading, that wealth, but you're spreading that burden, right? And you're making them more invested in the project as well. And I think that can be another great way both to solve a little bit of your funding need and also to get some people on board that are great partners for you.
Well, and especially, I totally agree with this. I see a lot of young entrepreneurs afraid of giving away equity at all. And fundamentally, there's a point at which it doesn't matter, right? If you're successful enough for that equity to ever be relevant, you keeping some portion of it, like if you're keeping especially 51% of it, you will be making enough money that, sure, the difference between you making $10 million and $20 million, who cares, right? And you can never make that $20 million if you don't get past that first stage where you get the right people in and all those things. So don't worry about using your equity. It's one of the assets that you have early on, whether it's for investors or for other employees. Don't hoard it all for yourself, because I feel like that's also one of the aspects of a good boss.
So I'm going to throw in a sneaky lawyer tip here. Depending on how your company is structured, you may actually be able to create a class of non-voting equity. So you can incentivize people because they get to share in the revenue and the profits of the company, or not the revenue, the profits of the company when you do distributions, but they don't actually get to vote on anything. So you still have complete control over how the company works. And doing that is in my mind, it's a good balance because it gives your people the incentive to take, quote unquote, ownership of the company, but you don't have to give them any sort of actual say in the final decisions, right? If Microsoft comes along and says, we want to buy your studio, you can just make that call on your own.
And you can make their stock vest, which just means that they don't actually get all of it until they've worked for you for like 3 or 4 years. So you can make sure that somebody just doesn't come in and then 6 months later decide that they want to take a much higher paying gig and get to keep all that stock.
Yeah, so Nate and I just came from the panel on, or the presentation on publisher agreements, which it was briefly mentioned as a way you could raise money from a publisher. How many of you in this room were in that same presentation? Okay, so a few. So Nate, I wonder if you could weigh in on just the economics of the publishing agreement and maybe considerations to take into account as the developer.
Sure. So absolutely another way that you can help fund some of your operations is going to be through striking a deal with your publisher, with perhaps multiple publishers. Not every publisher deal is necessarily going to have an advance, but a lot of publishers may be willing, under the right circumstances, to advance you funds, right? So they're going to help with some of your development costs, and that can be an invaluable way, especially if you are pretty new, to fund a lot of your operations. But bear in mind, too, that, someone's not going to just sort of write you a blank check, and they're not going to write you a check sort of, on day one if you've literally never done anything. So, publisher advances, publisher minimum guarantees, et cetera, can be a very important part of how you not just secure funds, but you space out the funds that you need for your operations. But you do also want to be a little bit realistic that that's not going to be sort of a day one way that you are likely to be generating a lot of the funds that you may need. Again, that may be a little bit different if you are, a very seasoned person and you've come up with a, really great idea, that may be a little bit sort of different. But a lot of times that's something you may have to wait a little bit for. But even if there's not that, there's a lot of costs that you're going to have, right? You've got development costs, but you've also got your marketing costs and things like that. And even if a publisher is not necessarily willing to help you out with some of your game development costs or with advancing royalties, they may be willing to, pay money towards your marketing. They may be willing to do the marketing themselves. There's a lot of things that publishers, can do that will essentially, from a dollar standpoint, still be helping you out financially. And of course, other support that, we could talk about as well, too.
So one thing that I would mention is that publishers are typically going to have milestone deliverables in their agreements. Mm-hmm. So you'll deliver something, they'll look at it, and if they accept it, then they'll pay you. But there's a delay there, right? So you deliver something, maybe they don't accept it the first time, you got to change some things, and then you resubmit it and they accept it the next time. Now you're 30 days out from where you thought you were actually going to get paid. But then they have like net 30 or net 60 terms, which means they don't actually have to turn around and hand you the check for another 30 or 60 days. So even if you have this, flow of money from a publisher, it's important to keep in mind your budgets on a day-to-day basis, the cash flow. What you don't want to do is get to a point where you're waiting on 90 days worth of payments from your publisher, and you can't make payroll, even though maybe you've got $300,000 coming next week, but you can't pay your employees this week. That's not a good situation for anybody. So on the topic of employees, what are your thoughts on the appropriate time to hire and roles for contractors versus employees?
We're like a contractor shop right now. And when we have the founding team, so we take guaranteed payments. So if you have a business and it's set up like an LLC, if you pay yourself out from the business, you're paying yourself guaranteed payments. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong on any of that, but that's how
Talk
we
to
do
your
it.
CPA about that.
Yeah, talk to your accountant. And then when we need extra help for either a client project or for our original IP, we'll hire a contractor. And we're trying to move to hiring full-time people. So we're in that stage of our business. Obviously, if you start with $30 million in the bank, you can not do that.
So how do you balance their role with you as a contractor versus their sort of obligation to, feed their families and buy clothes and things like that?
Still pay them the rate that they're worth. Obviously, they should not accept the gig if they can't afford to. You also can't treat them like a full-time employee. So you give them, this is either the amount of hours per week. So it may be 40 hours per week, but it may be a certain time period. So only for 3 months. Because at some point, you're crossing that shady boundary of they're a full-time employee, and then they should be treated like one, and you should do withholding. But if not, you can do a part-time contractor, or you can say, this is the fixed milestone, this is the deliverable I want from you, and this is what it's supposed to look like, and here's how it's defined in our statement of work. And from there, if they don't deliver, then that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, and don't sweat it too much, but at least in Washington state, it really is contractors are employed based on fixed deliverables. And so we can't even say, okay, these are vacation days, right? You can have these days off. They have a fixed deliverable that they're contractually obligated to give us. And however they solve that problem, unless it's spelled out in the contract, they can do whatever hours, whatever anything else they want, as long as they hit that. So just be aware of all the other things surrounding being a contractor that you as a boss have to know, but also don't sweat it. So long as you're decent to people, for the most part, and you've gotten good contractors who you trust, everybody's just trying for the same thing, right? To make a great product at the end of the day and get all of you paid. So don't, as you said, with this being the boss battle and not being the boss battle, there's a lot of scary stuff. A lot of it also boils down to, at the beginning, you can't worry about all of it and just try and be as decent as you can to everyone.
Yeah, that's great advice. Oh, sorry.
Should we talk, Brandon, about sort of the sort of differences people should bear in mind a little bit in terms of what's contracted?
I was literally about to ask you to answer that question. So
Sure.
Yeah, go right ahead.
So, well, first, actually, this is probably as great a place as any for me to say, while I am a lawyer and I am currently playing one, not on TV, but I guess live streaming, I'm not your attorney.
Nor am I.
Brandon.
Yeah.
So,
I was actually wondering when that was
one at
supposed to happen.
No, but in all seriousness, yes, I'll go through what are some of the things that you need to bear in mind in terms of, what an independent contractor is as opposed to what an employee is. But it is a very sort of circumstance-dependent kind of thing. And so you need to sort of take all of this with kind of a grain of salt and realize that, you really have to kind of look at your exact circumstance, and it wouldn't be possible to sort of kind of describe every circumstance in just, a minute or whatever here. So bear that in mind that, you'll have to consider a lot of things. But so, one thing I would say is there's kind of almost in a sense, when you say using independent contractors, there's kind of almost two things you could be talking about. So one, we kind of touched before about the idea of, acting a little bit as a dev shop or co-dev shop, et cetera, right? So you could work on an independent contractor basis with, a full other company, right, that has, 40, 100 of its own employees. And that is a great way that you can scale and just sort of probably not even need to worry a whole lot about any of these issues at all. But I think what a lot of people are probably thinking about here really is more that circumstance of an individual who is working with you, not through another company, or maybe, they have their own, LLC, but it's just them working out of their house, that sort of independent contractor. So the biggest thing really there, and James was touching on this a little bit, is it's really the concept of control. So the biggest thing that's going to determine in most contexts is whether or not you have control over that person or not. And you do need to bear in mind that the rules are different if you are talking, the federal level, the state level. There can be local laws that can apply. So, I'm going to guess that probably most people in the room are from the Southeast. Maybe a lot of you are from Georgia. So I'll talk a tiny bit about Georgia, but you need to bear in mind where you live does make a difference. And states have similar concepts, but different ones of them are a little bit more aggressive than others. And it makes a difference, too. Are we talking employment taxes? Are we talking the IRS? All those things. The government wants its money. So if they think you did it wrong, they're going to find whatever way to argue you did it wrong that they are. But that biggest concept, it's going to be control. And they're going to look at things like, like James is saying, like, you can tell them, I want this deliverable on this date, but for the most part, you're going to be leaving it to them to figure out how to get there, right? Who are they hiring? How many people do they need? What order are they doing things in? What equipment are they using? All those sorts of things. If you're telling them what they have to do, it's going to start to look more like an employee relationship. And that means the potential that you are liable for things like those employment taxes, et cetera, that you weren't doing. And the state governments, the federal governments, they will come after people because, again, there's two certainties, right? Death and taxes, and they want to make sure they're getting their taxes. So that's one big thing. Very commonly, independent contractors are going to be paid, like you guys are referencing, for a fixed fee, right? You're going to pay, hey, I want this piece of art, and I'm going to pay you $1,000, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to pay you, $30 an hour, and I'm just going to keep paying you every hour. That's going to look more and more like an employee situation. One of the biggest things, we could probably talk about this for an entire panel, so I'll kind of wrap it up and just say one of the couple things to bear in mind. It's not as simple as, is this person working for me for a short period of time, or this person only works for me, during the summer when they're out of school. It's not something, of course, that isn't relevant. It's going to matter whether or not they're working for you for a long period of time or not. But they could be a short-term employee. They could be a seasonal employee. So you do have to be thinking about all those things. But all that said, it actually could be a great way to both quickly ramp up when you have extra needs. If you get a great project that comes in, right? It's a way to quickly ramp up. And it can be a very cost-effective way, too, I think. I think you have to think about the all-in cost, things like, what's the cost when you get something back that you don't like from your independent contractor, right? That's a cost. Somebody in your team has to look at it and decide, are we happy with this? There's a lot of things we could talk about there, like I said. And I don't know if you have follow-up questions, Brandon, or other things.
So I do have one follow-up question, which is how do you decide, or how do you know what the market rate for your first employee is, or your first contractor?
I wish that I could say market rate even mattered, but most of the time it's, I have X dollars. Can we get someone to do this for that amount of money?
A little bit of both. Yeah. I mean, we were like, we have a budget to hire. This is our budget that we're siphoning out. Also, this is the other thing I've noticed, because I've worked with people who they won't think about their budgets 4 months in advance. If you can get to a point where you're like, I know what the cash flow is for the next 4 to 6 months, it's so much easier to have a conversation with people about the budget and know that you have $10,000 to spend on X thing, and to be able to hire that person with confidence that the money's going to be there in the bank and that you will have less trouble. So part of it is budget, but part of it is also what's their experience level. And then you can either change the role to match their experience level or try to hire for the role, but it's going to depend on the money.
And I mean, sometimes that's also what I mean by, if you have a certain budget, sometimes there's only up to a certain level of experience that you're going to be able to get. And then you have to ask yourself, can that person really handle this, right? And if so, I mean, sometimes I've hired people right out of college who have done incredible work. But that's just always something you have to balance.
And continuing to look is a cost, too. I mean, finding great people is hard, but, I mean, if you've got a position open for 6 months, I mean, that's 6 months that you're either not getting whatever that thing was that you needed, or it's 6 months that you're moving slower. So there's a lot of things you got to balance. But
although, interestingly on that, I've worked with a lot of companies that actually know sooner or later we'll need another game designer. And we can afford to have them on the payroll even when we don't have 100% we don't have stuff for them to do 100% of the time. So we're going to leave open a job position until we find the absolute best, perfect person. And so sometimes if you can anticipate your needs and do have the war chest, I have seen advantages to just having a open job posting out there.
Yep. Yeah, and you want to be careful you don't get those wrong people, right?
Right.
And a bad hire, I mean, it's hard to move on from. I mean, and it could really sink your culture, and I mean, it's a very, important process to be careful at. And I think early on too, I mean, like, depending on how many people you have, I mean, I'm sure that, there are people for you guys that have to do lots of different roles, right? That have to wear lots of different hats. And I would think that flexibility is a real asset, right?
Yes, it would definitely be a real asset. In the case of independent contractors, we have to obviously define exactly what they're working on. I wish I had way less hats. All of us do.
So we almost always include a phrase in an independent contractor agreement that says, or such other duties as may be assigned by the company from time to time. And what that really means is we might ask you to do something else. And if you can do it under this budget, that's great. Go ahead. But so you don't always have to stay within a very narrow scope of work. But so one last question about independent contractors, and this could be either from your perspective doing contract work or from the perspective of hiring contractors. How do you handle who owns their work product?
So on my side, we just have, I mean, honestly, in all the contracts that the company owns 100% of the work they've done. And then occasionally if they ask us things like, can you show it in my portfolio? We just say, yeah, sure. And that we'll give you if we need to spell it out, a license to show that work, but no actual ownership of the work. Mm-hmm.
So when we work as an independent contractor for our clients, they own everything we deliver, with the exception of if we've created something that they're licensing. So something that we already wrote and they're going to rescan, that would be them licensing part of our work product that we own in our intellectual property. And then as far as, we actually have interns right now. We have another one we're bringing on in January. We don't put interns on any client work. We don't even put them on original IP work. They get to work on whatever they want. They own it, even though we pay them. And that's just to keep things a lot simpler because we don't really want to deal with it. But yeah, interns like a whole other conversation. I was just bringing that in because it's a little bit relevant.
Yeah, so you did mention that you pay your interns.
Yeah, we pay them.
Yeah, so
they're high school students.
Why do you pay your interns?
Because it's the right thing to do. Yeah. Well,
well done, by the way.
How do you teach accountability without a salary? Well, not necessarily salary, because it's not salary. How do you teach accountability without money?
Well, and more than that,
in high school level.
People just deserve to be paid for their work, right? Like, we've had lots of people who volunteer to do art for extra credits, and we pay every single person, even if you're a guest artist or whatever, we make sure to pay every single person because you're doing work. You deserve to be paid for it. Exposure is not actually enough, right? You cannot eat off of it. So yeah, I totally agree with you, and that's awesome that even as a small shop, you guys are paying your interns. That's very
You can afford minimum wage, seriously. At least minimum wage.
And if you can't afford minimum wage, you shouldn't hire someone. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even as an intern.
Okay, so moving off of the employee contractor thing for a little bit. So we talked briefly about publishers. So obviously their goals don't always align with your goals. Their goals are to maximize your work product and deliverables for them in a way that they can make money off of it. And your goal is probably to make money, but also to create something that you like to create. So how do you maximize a relationship with a publisher? Not necessarily from a legal perspective, but just how do you find a publisher that is going to be a good fit, and how do you maximize that relationship?
Well, so I would throw out that, one of the most important things is you want to make sure you're doing, essentially your homework, right? I mean, in my world, we'd call it due diligence, but you want to do your homework about who those publishers are, right? And you've got your own culture, whether you are, a 2-person shop or 200-person shop, you have your own culture, and a relationship with a publisher, I mean, a good publisher relationship, I mean, there's, you could draw some analogies to a marriage, right? I mean, for better or worse, for a certain period of time at least, you're kind of stuck with each other. And so you want to make sure that going in, you realize what that publisher is like. I mean, everything from who are you really going to be working with there, what kind of experience do they have with games that are like yours, right? I mean, if you're making very casual mobile games, the right publisher for you might not be somebody who does nothing but enormous AAA games and, has literally no experience whatsoever with making, a simple, casual, quick mobile game. So I think fit is something that people a lot of times sort of kind of forget about, and I think that people really early on too, sometimes you're probably going to be, so happy about getting some deal that, you want to make sure that you're not just, too quickly, kind of going with the same first person you meet kind of thing.
I feel like publishing on mobile is so different now because y'all were talking about getting advances, and that's just not even a world that is in a reality that mobile is in anymore. I mean, maybe a couple of people can get an advance on a mobile game, but I'm talking about it tomorrow at 10 a.m. if anyone's awake. Basically, it's all about showing retention metrics early on, and then if you're lucky and your retention is good in a small market, you can get a user acquisition budget from a quote-unquote publisher. But you can literally walk into anyone with good retention metrics and say it's going to be a put money in, get money out situation at that point. So you don't even need a publisher. You just need someone with money and who can look at metrics.
So let me just ask real quick. You said good metrics. What's a good day 1, day 2, day 3 retention rate?
Depends on genre and platform a lot.
Okay.
But yeah, App Store, 48% up for D1, and then D7 and D30 are really, really dependent on game type, genre, and that sort of stuff.
Sort of in the AAA world, there's a couple of things to remember. First off, before you actually sign anything, everything is still in flux, and always remember that. A lot of publishers are incentivized to tell you that they liked your game and would like to see more of it, would be happy for you to show it to them again later down the line. And they may couch this in a way that makes it sound like they're very interested in your game and you're going to get a publishing deal. But really what they want you to do is build as much of it on your own budget as they can get you to do, and then once it's as sure a thing as possible, then sign you, right? That's not evil, that's just the business practices that they need to do to maintain being a publisher. Just be aware of it. The easiest way to get a publisher to actually sign a deal is have somebody else interested. So publishers will also sort of quietly discourage you from talking to other publishers about your game. Unless you've signed something that says you can't, don't worry about it. Go talk to a number of different publishers, start getting your thing out there, start getting some buzz within the industry. That will end up getting you a better deal. When you're looking for a publisher, I completely agree with everything that was said about fit. Also, try and figure out what you want from the publisher, because different publishers are good at different things. If what you really need is marketing rather than funding up front, there's a publisher that does that, right? If what you really need is someone to manage your network infrastructure, your global sort of integration and getting you into foreign markets, and operating your real money transactions, that's probably a different publisher. So make sure you also know what your publisher does and what you want from them beyond just the money. And then after that, it's all people. In the end of the day, it's all people. And if you can find somebody who seems genuinely passionate about your game, that goes a long way.
Great. So moving on from publishers to distributors. So in the last couple of weeks or months, we've heard some pretty large titles have moved away from Steam or moved away from the App Store, that kind of thing. In recent memory, though, those have been sort of the last gateway to consumers for digital distribution. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on what that relationship looks like between the developer and the distributor, if there is one, and what the 30% gets you?
So in my experience, it's best if you can have a relationship with the distributor, but 99% of the games that hit Steam or the App Store, there is basically no actual relationship between the between the distributor and the developer.
We are really fortunate in that we were able to finally build a direct connection with Apple about a year ago. But it took 7 years working in games. It was hard. You have to meet someone to meet someone to meet someone to meet someone. And finally, maybe Apple will look at your game. And so I'll never talk bad about them. They've been really, really good to us. But I can see it's business. And if you have a giant game, Fortnite, you may not want to have 30% taken from your income. Why would you, unless you absolutely for a technical reason need to use a distributor, why wouldn't you just distribute it yourself? If you've got the capital to funnel it through the browser and just do direct download executable, you should do that.
Yeah, I think that I would agree with, the things that are being said, and obviously, realistically speaking, I mean, most of the platform holders, the biggest ones, I mean, we're talking some of the biggest companies on the planet, right? So they're enormous. Of course, they work with, they publish tons and tons and tons of games on their platform. So yeah, a lot of times, I mean, the relationship is not going to be huge. I think it'll be interesting to see if we are seeing a little bit of a trend away from some of them, and there are some other competitors to Steam, for example, that are coming out, and perhaps that will change a little bit how things are in the marketplace. But there's probably also something to be said for the idea that when you talk about like Fortnite, and not going to the Google Play Store, I mean, are we really just talking about the exception that sort of proves the rule, right? I mean, we're talking about something still being newsworthy, that even the biggest game on the planet has decided it can somehow get by without going to the Google Play Store. And it's kind of like, wow, so it's, to a degree, I think it does a little bit sort of, serve as potentially just the exception that proves the rule. But, hopefully it is a little bit of a, harbinger of things to come, that, as we get some of these more competitors to Steam, that, perhaps there'll be more options for people, and maybe discoverability will be a little bit easier. But at the same time, more and more games keep getting made, so you're competing with more and more games all the time.
And just to add to what you said about the multiple different distribution platforms, most distribution platforms don't preclude you from distributing on other distribution platforms. And so I've seen people whose games did nothing on Steam, but then on itch.io, because it's just a very different audience and a very different platform, they were able to garner enough attention to sort of get moved to the top, get more visibility from the itch.io folks, all that sort of thing. So feel free, do distribute your game on a number of platforms if you can do so without incurring cost yourself. And then, like you were talking about developing that relationship, one of your business goals, if you're going to do this long term, should be to try and develop those relationships. Go to conferences where you'll meet these people. As you build out these games, as you meet, as you work for clients that might have some of these relationships, build those relationships, because they'll be very valuable if you can have them.
Consider too exclusivity. Like if you once you have those relationships, like offer up and say,
Right.
We would be willing to be exclusive for 2 weeks or a month or however long for your platform, because it may help. They may not give you a guarantee, we're going to feature you in X area, but it still helps.
So can you talk a little bit, what is the value of, so we've talked about the value of the relationship, but that relationship nets you things like being featured. So like being featured on the front page of a distribution platform, what sort of effect does that practically have?
The literal money effect can be saving you like over $100,000.
Yeah.
So, for example, an app install can cost, depending on the month or the year. September is a really bad time to launch. Don't do it unless you have capital. September through December, you should just not launch on the App Store unless you have at least $500,000 in the US. And I'm serious, because it's all about playing the charts. So if you cannot get your game into the top 10, it won't make money. Now, we still did it, and we did it because we knew this is how much the money the app is going to actually make at that time, and we're just going to do it. Now, if you get featured, it's basically free installs. So you're not paying for the user acquisition that it would cost to get those people into your game, which can be anywhere between $4 and $7 per install in the United States. That's incredible, right? You have to pay $7 per person. That's astronomically.
So that's you're talking advertising.
Yeah. Your cost per install costs.
Yeah, not mailing out checks for $7 that say.
No. And you can get those down the better you know your audience and the different platforms that you use to advertise on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So on the topic of knowing your audience, so I want to make sure we leave time for questions, but I want to talk a little bit about the audience and the fans. So as a founder or a company owner, or even just a C-suite person at a company that's a larger company, what, if any, relationship do you think you directly should have with that audience?
Well, I think it's it's sort of a cultural thing. I mean, I think that, with every studio, it's going to be a little bit different. And I think that you want to stay, I would say first and foremost, you want to stay true to yourself. You don't want to come across disingenuous, and, your audience won't like it. Your your coworkers won't like it if they're all feeling forced to kind of, be this, this personality that they really aren't, right? And so I think one of the most important things is to be yourself and be genuine. And hopefully you've made a lot of right hires that you can trust to sort of do that individually as well. But I think as a studio, I think one of the it is worthwhile thinking about what do you want our personality to be, and who is our audience going to be, and how do those two things kind of mesh up.
I think that eventually, though, you also have to realize that your connection to that audience may change. For us, I used to answer every email that Extra Credits got by hand. I can no longer do that due to the realities of time. We've hired a person to look at every email, and even they can't respond to every single email that we get in a day's worth of time. And so you have to look at how some of that changes, and also how, as your company grows, sort of what you say directly to that audience may have a bigger and bigger impact on more and more people's lives. But at the end of the day, no matter what, you still do need to know that audience, and be aware of that audience, and be listening to that audience, even if you're not speaking quite as directly to that audience.
So what happens when the audience turns hostile? How do you handle that?
I knew that's where this question was going.
So this is my point. I mean, I don't know if you had to see, but the keynote, my last point, is definitely listening to the audience does not mean the audience is always right. And I know as lawyers, you probably have, but I think we as a community have to stand up when the audience turns hostile, when there is this negativity, when there is this toxicity. We as businesses have to say, no, this is not acceptable, and be the curators of this community, because in the end of the day, even if we're just making the business case, toxicity costs us an enormous amount. If we just look at the gender ratio in this room, right, we're losing an enormous number of customers. There are all sorts of people from all sorts of marginalized groups that we lose, and we can no longer afford to make AAA games on just that core demographic of 14 to 25-year-old males. Because when you're spending $250 to $500 million making a game, it takes a lot of game sales to make that back, and you're just never going to make that on what the traditional core audience is anymore. So we really have to stand up to this audience and say, hey, because when the audience turns hostile, almost every time actually I've seen in my entire career, it's not been the majority of your audience. It's been a vocal minority that has a lot of time to be hammering at the gates, but at the end of the day, if you listen to them, by listening to them, you're silencing a lot of other people.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add there. I think the biggest mistakes companies make is they're not assertive, they're wishy-washy, and then they do not defend their employees when that happens. It's obvious to everyone who wants to work in games, everyone who already works in games. With the amount of money I make today, I could go work anywhere else and make more money. So why would I keep doing that for someone who doesn't back me up?
Mm-hmm. So we have saved some time for questions. Before we get to that, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been on the panel. Thank you all for coming. I also want to mention that if in your career, and James talked a lot about this yesterday, it doesn't work out, that's okay, right? I have dissolved a lot of companies, and that's okay. That's okay.
Oh, good, Brandon.
Those people are still
This
working.
This is a really uplifting ending point.
No, well, I'm saying it's okay if your company doesn't work out. That's the reason you formed the company, right? Is so that
To have it not work out?
No. So if you personally, individually go out and you fail and you lose your own money, that's a problem. But if you start a company and you get other people's money and then you fail, it's okay.
Best advice ever.
And so we'll take questions now. Yeah.
While you were talking about the contractor stuff, one that popped in my head was how do you manage licenses for software and things like that the contractor might use that you don't actually have a license for or something like that? How do you track it and those sorts of things?
So I've seen that handled a lot of different ways. what typically happens is the contractor is responsible for providing their own tools to complete the job. That's the standard starting point. And the contractor, in their contractor agreement, you should have them represent and warrant to you that they're going to use only licensed software and they're not going to infringe on any third-party rights. You are taking on a little bit of risk that they actually do that, because it could come back to bite you if, say, Adobe or Autodesk found out that your game was made with unlicensed software, right? So the alternative there is for you to acquire it and then hold it against their payment, but that's not a good system, really.
Yeah, one of the reasons small businesses use independent contractors is because they don't have to buy their computers. They don't have to buy their licenses. They're responsible for managing that as a sense of autonomy. So it's more affordable to hire independent contractors because there's all these other expenses that don't come with it. It should be baked into their hourly or fixed rate in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if they're making a career out of being an independent contractor, they should already have those licenses. Yeah. I think we have one over here. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about how have you guys handled crunch times and deadlines?
Well, I'm not a developer, so I'm looking at the people who work inside of companies, right?
Badly.
Poorly. So bad.
Especially as like a company owner.
That's not fair.
Yeah.
Not a fair question.
I've done a lot of 80-hour weeks in my life, and I don't think it was the right answer necessarily. I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask on this.
I don't know if any of us are, truthfully, because like as a business owner, you're supposed to put as much time as you possibly can into your business. At the same time, you can also like, I don't know, end up in divorce or just have a really bad personal life because of it.
She didn't mean that, Justin.
No, I love you, sweetie. My husband's in the audience. No, we're doing fine. But I constantly question whether my business has taken over my home life. Because it's the same problem you have the same problem as a business owner as you do as an employee. And you say, oh, I'm going to put as much time into my business and I'm not going to do this to my employees. But they look at you and they're like, I should be putting in 90 hours a week. And you're like, there's no way to win. There's literally no way to win. I don't know how we get out of this, honestly, without unionization, but that's a whole other panel that we're not on.
That would be an intriguing panel, though.
And it's not just about that too, right? I mean, I think it's also, part of what you're talking about is just, it's not just knowing when the perfect has become the enemy of good and things like that, but it's also just, this is something you're passionate about, right? You want it to be as good as it can be, but at the same time, you need to, you got to balance some of those other things, including the economic realities and the user expectations, right? I mean, for if you're doing games as a service, for example, like we do, our users are expecting a patch on such and such day, and we obviously want the patch to be as great as we can for any number of reasons, including that we're very passionate about our games, but also at the same time, there's a whole bunch of people who are kind of hoping that on their Tuesday, this is what they were going to be doing, and if you're not giving it to them, it's sort of like, all right, well, you're also sort of kind of took away whatever they were hoping to do that night. So I don't know. There's a lot of things to balance in terms of, meeting, doing the best thing for your customers and for, your coworkers and everything.
So the one legal thing that I would add to that's strictly speaking, straight up legal, it's very dry. There's something called an exempt employee. An exempt employee is an employee that gets paid a salary and doesn't qualify for overtime. Most of your employees, if you have more than one employee, most of your employees are not going to be exempt employees, so pay them overtime. Or that can really come back to bite you. If they sue you for it, you have to pay them their back pay, what they should have been paid, plus treble damages, which is 3 times what they should have been paid. So just pay them up front.
And just so it's clarified for everyone, that is not the same if you are a business owner, you are a founder.
Right. If you are the owner, you can work as many hours as you want. Yeah.
You probably shouldn't work 90 hours a week. Yeah. Try not to.
Yeah. More. Oh, yeah, they moved the microphone up here. So if you want to ask a question, if you can kind of come line up here, that'd be great.
All right. So I guess like a question for anyone that's trying to start a business, what are some thresholds that you wish you could tell like a younger version of yourself, things that they should have avoided, rather it be legally or like just like rookie mistakes that you can avoid from the beginning to set yourself up better for the future?
Key thresholds.
So I guess I'll throw out a couple things sort of in the positive and the negative side. Probably most people in this room are passionate about games, or else they probably wouldn't be here. But, it's going to sound cliche and whatever, but, if you're doing something that you're really passionate about, I think you've got a much better chance of being successful. And you certainly have a much better chance of those 90-hour weeks being a little bit more enjoyable. So I think that's certainly something that could do. That said, we don't all have necessarily that luxury. It sounds great to say things like, I'll work without getting paid for 2 years until our game is successful, but you may have kids, you may have a spouse, you may have parents that depend upon you, you may have a mortgage, you may have student loans. So there's a lot of things there. I would say on the negative side, or excuse me, in the cautionary side, we talk about, for a lot of people, one of the biggest things you may have to do if you're starting your own thing is put in your own money, and being realistic about how much you really can put in, I think is very important, right? If you go, really too far with it, you could really, unfortunately, find yourself in sort of an unfortunate problem. And I guess a small legal thing I will throw out, while absolutely there are great advantages to setting up an LLC or an Inc. or things like that to kind of shield yourself from a little bit of your liability, especially if you are going to be taking outside investment from lenders, et cetera, early on. If your company doesn't have a lot of money, you're probably going to be signing a personal guarantee anyway. So the fact that you have a separate company that's an LLC, you're still going to owe the bank its money back. And bank financing is not the most common way that people tend to finance video games, but some of that same can play out with some other types of investments as well. But I don't know.
Similar note, get a bank account for the business as soon as possible. I waited way too long. Like, that was advice people kept giving me, and I was like, it's so hard. It's not hard. It is so not hard to get a federal identification number and then go to the bank and open up a bank account. It's actually too easy, I think. It's a little scarily too easy. So, do that, because otherwise you're going to be... So even if you start working as an independent contractor or as a sole proprietor and taking work, and you're running it through the same bank account as your personal expenses, you're spreadsheeting out what is a personal expense versus what is a business expense, so you don't have to pay as much on taxes. And it's a nightmare. If you get your own business bank account, it's so much easier. And then QuickBooks or any kind of way to track it, it's a lot easier.
And accountants are actually pretty cheap. I think it's worth early on just getting an accountant to deal with the taxes. But my piece of advice is actually one that I'm not sure I want to give, because I don't want to discourage this. But sometimes friends don't make the best employees. And it's very easy to start your first business with your friends and sometimes lose friends because of it. And I don't know if I would have done things differently in my life if I could tell myself that. But it's something that I wish I could have told myself.
Okay. I'll throw out one other thing, actually. This harkens back. We were talking a little about the publisher arrangements before. Most publishers, I think, absolutely do want the best for the games that they work with. But regardless of that, you do need to bear in mind that you really can shoot yourself in the foot and give away a lot of rights by signing a publisher agreement that doesn't protect you going forward. First and foremost, absolutely read the thing. Please try and get somebody else who knows them to, try and help you, read them as well. But, publishers will often early on, with people that don't know what they're doing, sadly, unfortunately, they'll sign things that say, we get to publish literally all of your games forever. Right. And I think some people, sometimes they don't even realize that they're giving that up, and then they're sort of kind of stuck in this bad circumstance. And like I said, I do think most publishers, I'm not trying to disparage them. I think they very much do by and large want the best for all the games they're working with. But bear in mind, there's a lot of things that are going on in that relationship, and be sure to think very carefully about it.
All right, so we'll take the next question. Thanks.
Thank you. So this kind of a big question. What are some of the things on the legal side do y'all hate the most about the AAA market and the indie market?
So hate the most about the AAA market in the indie. So like working in them, or
Yeah,
okay,
working and
or I
working
didn't know
with.
if you meant as a consumer and a fan.
No,
Okay,
no.
because those are different answers. Yeah.
I enjoy my job a lot. If anybody's listening, I really enjoy my job a lot. Truly I do. I came from a very large law firm. I worked really insane hours. The clients that I had were enormous banks, and they were people buying Major League Baseball teams, and you kind of went home when things were done. And if things weren't done, well, you kind of didn't go home. And, I don't work as much as I used to, but I still work hard. I still work a lot. And, it's certainly something that I was very fortunate when the opportunity came up. And I've enjoyed a lot. But there is still very much, every job in gaming, it may be a passion job for anyone, but it isn't necessarily true. It's not a club. It's still a job, and there's still going to be a lot of the downsides that come with any job. So I think that that's maybe something that people sometimes are a little bit unrealistic about when they kind of go into probably a lot of things in the gaming space. That like this is going to be phenomenal because it's it's gaming. Obviously, in the gaming space, a lot of the companies you're dealing with are really huge companies, and you have to legally kind of protect yourself in some of those relationships. And like any other business, there's also just an awful lot of legal considerations. I mean, we talk about how setting yourself up wrong in terms of paying people as if they're independent contractors when they're really employees, and not paying overtime, and all of a sudden you've got problems like triple damages. And it's great that you're paying your interns. We actually mostly pay our interns at Hi-Rez Studios as well. But at the same time, there's a lot of people that don't pay their interns, and that's not necessarily wrong or bad, but there's rules you've got to follow. And that's not a video game specific thing, but certainly there are lots of interns in the video game space, and people need to be very sort of particular about a lot of those things.
So I work. Sorry. I was just going to say I work with a lot of small developers, small to mid-sized developers. Hey guys. And so I think the frustrating thing for me about, and this is not specific to games really, but it does apply in games, is that the cost of justice, right, is something that lawyers talk about a lot. The cost of And I don't mean just the price of attorneys either. I mean the literal number of barriers that exist in the legal world for anyone outside the legal world are astronomical. And it's a lot easier for a big company to absorb that cost than a small company. And that's just really frustrating as somebody who wants to help those small companies, having to prioritize, look, you guys need 15 things done right now. I know you only have the budget for one. Let's look at what it is, right? That's just very frustrating a lot of the time.
I wanted to say one more thing about the interns, because you were saying some of them were paid. Some schools do not let you pay pay interns. Like if they're from university, they may have a rule where it's like, oh, well, this is a class credit thing. So I know everyone clapped, and that's awesome. But at the same time, we sometimes have to follow certain restrictions, or companies have to follow certain restrictions that aren't even of their own choice.
So I do want to move down the line. We've got a lot of questions here. It is 6 o'clock, so if anybody wants to go out and get beer, I know I like beer. I know Molly likes beer. Sometimes I've had too much beer. So we'll just move to the next question. But we're 6:30.
That makes it sweet.
Oh, never mind then.
I'm even going to chime in on that.
Yeah, chime in on the last one. I'm so sorry, everybody. I was trying to rush you out.
But we've given an excuse for the people who really wanted to bail. Luckily,
There we go.
So I'll just keep mine quick. In the AAA world, I hate trademark laws. Even sometimes when you want to let someone use your trademark, you kind of can't, and that's very frustrating. And then on the indie side, UGC, user-generated content, there's this problem of, oh, hey, it would be a great idea to have a level editor in my game. I want people to build whatever they want to build. If they build Mario, right, Sometimes that can be a problem for you. I was just working with a company that was building sort of a Dance Dance Revolution thing. They allowed people to create their own tracks and put them up there and put their own like dance sequences in with them. Well, what's the first thing people are going to do? Upload songs by Drake, right? And then you're screwed. And so navigating that, how do we allow UGC while also maintaining everyone else's intellectual property rights is the indie side thing that's a nightmare to me.
All right,
Yeah.
and then I just have one more follow-up. How do you think we could change the industry to make these problems better or lessen them?
I would love to see trademark and copyright a lot shorter, but there's a whole dialogue going on there.
Yeah, Mickey Mouse is your issue there.
Well, you know what kills me about Disney? If you think about every Disney film you ever saw, it uses someone else's IP, right? Like, it doesn't matter if it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or Aladdin, and yet they're pushing out the copyright every year.
So we could have another whole panel about that.
Oh, yeah. And especially at the rants, maybe that's...
Oh, yeah, there we go.
The next panel.
Thank you. So legal stuff scares the shit out of me.
That's fair. Illegal stuff you're fine with, but
yeah, I draw a hard line on legal. But so who knows about NCSoft? Who's played an NCSoft game?
Yeah.
Okay, so I read a story about NCSoft suing another developer who has a lot of employees that left NCSoft and made Black Desert Online, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. And NCSoft ended up suing them for trade secrets, which if I found out I was being sued for what I learned on a job, which is where you learn a lot of things, I mean, that's even more terrifying. What sort of extent is that? And I mean, is it just in the fine print of the contract? Like, could you elaborate on?
So I know only one trade secrets case that ever went to trial within the industry, and I can't really talk about it, but in that case, people literally walked out with hard drives under their coats, and there were engines and proprietary things.
That's secret trading.
Right, exactly. Just like, yeah, there's sort of like a Magic the Gathering market, but yeah, for hard drives. No, but that's, we do a lot with NDAs. Especially as a small developer, you should know that, yeah, you should have NDAs for stuff, and you guys can totally contradict me on this, but don't count on them to protect your secrets, right? Like, you can NDA people up, but it's very hard to establish that, oh, yes, you were the person who gave away this thing we were going to do. At the end of the day, I've seen very few of those cases actually go to trial.
So I will say, honor your NDAs.
Yes, you should absolutely do
If you sign an NDA, don't breach that NDA. Like, there are criminal penalties for violating an NDA now, so don't breach NDAs. Like, I just want to make sure we make that clear. The NCSoft thing, I'm not familiar with the specific allegations in that case, but just to move it away from that, also I'm very good friends with one of their general counsel, so I'm not going to talk about NCSoft specifically, but I will say that you look at some of the general trade secret cases, or the breach of contract cases. Like, you can look at the John Carmack and ZeniMax stuff, anything like that, where you have an ex-employee who's now doing something similar somewhere else. There's a gray area there, right? Like, because they did build something, presume if they're an engineer or they're a programmer, they did build something for your company that belongs to your company, and they've probably been hired to do something similar. But if it gets to the point where what they're doing is re-engineering what they just did for you, that's the problem, I think. That doesn't really answer your question, right? So if you're an engine programmer, right, and you get hired to create a solution for XYZ, and then you leave that company to go create the same solution for XYZ, and you implement it in roughly the same way, that's not, like, that is a trade secret violation. I don't know, Nate may disagree.
So one thing I would say is, if part of your kind of thinking is, hey, I've been working one place, now I'm going to go some other place, and that other place, you can certainly talk with them, and if they have attorneys or whatever about sort of the circumstance, and they may be able to help guide you through whether or not what you've learned at a past place is something that you can do or not, right? And I hesitate to wade in too much because I agree. I'm not really familiar with a lot of sort of the very specific cases in this area, but my general sense would probably be agreeing with you guys that a lot of times you're talking about pretty bad situations, right? And litigation. Brandon's absolutely right. I mean, one of the sort of concerns that there is worldwide, but especially in the U.S., is just the cost of securing justice, quite frankly. But even if you are the bigger party, even if you are Microsoft, it's expensive for you, right? So, I mean, people aren't looking for kind of like willy-nilly reasons to kind of go get into something. But I agree. I mean, you definitely want to honor your NDAs. I will throw out one little other thing related to NDAs. Read past the word mutual NDA at the top of the document. I get sent an awful lot of mutual NDAs that are not mutual past the word mutual in the title. So you should bear in mind that there are definitely people that will send you something that is not mutual.
And a lot of the big companies, the AAA companies, will send you a mutual NDA, and it will be a mutual NDA with one paragraph that is not mutual, and it's about what they're showing you that is more protected than what you're showing them. Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess the short answer is we can't say anything specifically about that because we don't know the facts and circumstances involved there. But in general, it's going to come down to the specifics of what's the work being done and what are the agreements on both sides say. So what does your agreement with your prior employer say belongs to them specifically? Okay. And also, what are you doing now and how does it relate back to what you did there?
Okay.
And so you might want to have a consultation with an IP lawyer at some point. Gotcha. Just to talk through that.
Okay. Yeah. And generally speaking, I would also just throw out, I mean, the more senior you are, the more critical what you're doing is, the more likely this is that there's going to be something that ever kind of comes up here that's really an issue, right? I mean, if any of you are just sort of starting out in the industry, right, and your first job is, as associate artist or whatever, I mean, don't in your portfolio take whatever piece of art you made at the last place, change the color of the character and reuse it, right? But that's very different than kind of like, hey, somebody's like, oh, you're not the poster child of what is going to be probably the biggest concern that somebody's going to have when you move between companies.
The skills you develop are yours, right? So in the art context, that's a good analogy, I think. So in the art context, like you draw a character here, and then you draw another one, and then you draw 30 characters from one company. Character 30 is probably better than character 1 because you have more practice now, right? When you go to your next company, you're still going to be using those skills you learned at the last job, but you're not going to draw those same characters again, right?
Okay. All right.
The actual lawsuit you're talking about was actually Blade & Soul versus Ker-Chunk Online. I was a senior designer and 5 other people that left the company and formed a new company. So they were high up on the list. They were making an action MMO, not advertising MMO. It was very similar in many different ways.
Okay.
And it also became very successful. So worth the money spent to actually seek out damages from it.
So did everybody hear that additional context? Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that elaboration. Thank you.
Actually, I'm supposed to repeat it for the stream. So the additional context is, if you don't mind, just so everybody's going to listen to it again so that the people on the internet get to hear it once.
Okay, so real quick, the actual lawsuit was between the guys who made Blade & Soul and Terra Online, and it was a group of like 5 people that were all seniors inside of the project for Blade & Soul that left to form their own company. So they were very deeply involved in the design of one game and made another game which is almost the exact same design, which then became very popular. And so it made a lot of money, making it so that it was actually worth the legal expense to try and seek the damages.
So mo money, mo problems. Next question.
Hi. So before you were talking about having a clientele list of like you're making games for the clients, but you weren't able to make enough money possibly to make your own game later. My question is, how did you make that leap from being indie and like part-time to actually getting that client list? I know the easy answer is, hey, you should network, share your games off. But even if you build it and show it off, they will come, and it's not really what happens? Like, how did you set yourself apart from everybody else? How did you get those clients? How did you get the publishers? It's for both of you, honestly. Sorry, legal guys.
So I've operated as a solo design consultant, and my path is super weird, so I think yours is probably more relevant.
It's probably still weird, though.
Yeah, I mean, actually, yours is probably also super weird because everything in this industry is super weird. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, so I mean, I didn't just like go from college straight into being an agency. I worked for another agency first, and then I actually. This is the one regret. That question where someone was like, "Oh, could you give advice to yourself?" I wish I had stayed there for a year longer in a full-time position before creating my business, and just like went to stuff like this and asked a bunch of questions and just continued to save money. Because my money, I put $30,000 into my business, and it was gone like in a couple of months, just from tons of fees and licenses and just all the things you have to do when you first create a business. And I could have started a lot slower and smaller, but I just started turning people I knew into clients, being like, hey, I do UX, UI design, and then Leah also does a lot of art and narrative design, and we just started working with different people and building up from there. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, we suddenly have a client roster of 100 people. And really bad about keeping Brandon in the loop about how many clients we sign on. So don't do that. Try to keep your lawyer always informed of the SOWs you sign. Don't be me. But yeah, it was a slow process. It's still a slow-ish process because we are a boutique agency. So we're not looking to have a client roster of 100 people. We're looking to have a client roster of max. And that's if we need to keep with the agency model of maybe 30, just enough to kind of be, I don't want to grow beyond like 30, 50 people. I'm not really interested in that. At least right now, I'm not. We'll see.
So the question was beyond just networking. So you're saying like work the network.
Yeah, work your network. Like say
your network.
Oh yeah, but also like there's some more tactical stuff, which is probably too much for this panel, but like create a deck. A lot of people are like, I gotta have the website. Actually, we do all our business through like a deck, and sometimes we'll password protect it because we're really respectful to our clients. Speaking of NDAs, of what we've worked on, and we'll say, hey, is it okay if we include your like logo in our deck to say we've worked with you? Or can we show this from this project? Getting permission and stuff like that. Being careful about what we can talk about that we've worked on.
Okay, awesome.
On my side, I was just really lucky, right? My first full-time gig in the AAA industry turned out to spontaneously be on the biggest series in the world. And then after that, I had also, while working at Activision and while moving into client work, I had done a lot of writing about design theory, and there wasn't a lot of people out there writing about design theory at the time. And so there were a lot of articles on Gamma Sutra, on Edge, and all these things that the industry sort of went to with my name and my contact info on them. And the first year I did my consulting, I made $10,000 in the entire year, right? Not after expenses, total. And that was a rough year, and lots of ramen. And actually, it was a lot of beans and tortillas. And then, luckily, sort of from that writing and from the other projects I had done, I got some other big name clients, and I lucked into a couple of other really big projects. And once you have a couple of those, if you can somehow survive long enough to just hit the right roll of the dice and get a couple of those, then you just put those front and center on your deck on whenever you're having that conversation. And that the way our industry works, people listen.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Hi there. In the team building panel, there was a discussion that we talk a lot about leadership, and you all touched on that a lot, but we don't talk enough about followership in the game industry, and not so much, I'm the lone genius, come be a contractor for my great idea, but here are my skills, what can I contribute? I was wanting to get your all's take on that from your own experience. Were you always the lone genius, or what did it take to meet other people and say, we're all going to contribute to something together?
Begging. Just kidding.
I wish either of those things were really an option. I had an early boss say to me, you will either always be working on someone else's dream or raising the money so other people can work on your dream, but you'll never actually be working on your own dream. And for me, like, I don't think I've ever gotten to, I do the stuff that no one else wants to do because that's what keeps the business alive, right? And so I don't necessarily see that big distinction in my career. I would love, all I want to do is write, and if I could actually follow someone and still keep the people that are employed in my businesses employed, I would do that in a heartbeat rather than try and actually hold the thing together. It's a lot of stress and a lot of work to be like the point at which everyone's going to blame if everything falls apart. So I wish I had better advice on that, being a good follower side. Just pitch in where you can. And no, that's actually the thing. Sorry, I just realized it. Know that your boss is a human being too, and they're making their decisions for a reason, and sometimes you will have genuinely terrible bosses. But a lot of the time, decisions that may not make sense to you, they are making for a reason, and a lot of the time you can go ask about those things. And do that, because I met a lot of people who would like that opportunity to talk and communicate, may not realize that they even have the time to talk and communicate about these things with the employees, but just realize that your boss is also a human being with a lot of stress, and if you can do that, I think that that's one of the best traits in terms of being a follower employee.
Yeah, and bosses should own up to their mistakes.
Yeah.
I was just telling Brandon about one I made earlier that I'm going to have to own up to.
I can't talk about that.
We're not going to. But I have learned so much in the last 4 years. I started our company in 2014, and I'm still learning to be a business owner. You'll meet entrepreneurs, serial entrepreneurs, and they'll have like their 5th business. I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. But we've managed. I mean, we have done extremely well this year, and I'm really, really proud of us, but it took 4 years to get there. And that patience, I'm so glad I had the patience, because if I didn't have that, we would be gone. I could have walked away yesterday, but I would have let a lot of people down, not just the people that were working with us or the people that are dependent on their financial income with us, but the people that were emotionally invested in it too. To your followers' point, the people that are also emotionally invested in you as a business owner is like just a massive pool of people that you will eventually let down if you walk away. Not saying that you can walk away from a failure, but if you can stick with it long enough to see it succeed, 4 or 5 years, there's a chance that your business may work.
So I would say this is not necessarily specific to games. I would give the same advice to a leader as I would a follower, and that's to be graceful. Right? So when you're asking those questions of your superiors, when you're saying, why are we doing it this way? Do it tactfully and gracefully. And if you don't like the answer, don't accept the answer, but do it tactfully and gracefully. And if you're leading and somebody comes and challenges your authority, explain to them why you're doing what you're doing gracefully, right? There's just be polite and dignified to people, and I think that usually gets the best results.
Great,
Thank you. Actually, one little thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's not directly sort of your question, but I agree. This is sort of, I would say the same to both the leaders and the followers. You don't want to be, and you will develop a reputation very quickly in a lot of organizations when you are one of those people who is constantly switching between the word I and the word we. And when you keep saying I when everything is going great, and you are owning all of that success yourself, and then when things aren't going so great in a project and you start using we over and over again, we made this choice, people are going to figure out pretty quickly that you're the sort of person that, you're out for yourself and you're not looking to share the success with everybody else. And I think that, that is true for both the leaders and the followers, but that's something I would throw out.
Okay. Yeah. It's like from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. I don't know if you've read that, but
I don't, but
Okay.
it sounds like it was great.
You should write you should write a book.
There's a really good book called Leaders Eat Last, which is
Oh,
on
yeah,
the
Simon
same kind
Sinek.
of, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. Okay, thank you.
Great panel. Thank you all for being here. Excuse me. This might be a no-brainer, but I thought I'd ask anyway. For independent contractors and studios that provide content for other developers or studios, do you have any thoughts on dealing with toxic relationships or professional relationships that end up being that, maybe in the long run?
Well, I guess I'll throw out a couple things from a legal standpoint. You know, this will sound a little bit like saying go into a marriage having a prenup, but quite frankly, you do want to think about the fact that most relationships will end at some point in time, right? And I mean, that's not just a video game specific thing, and that's not just a independent contractor sort of thing, but you know, you do want to bear in mind that at some point in time, for whatever reasons, right, and it may not be anything bad, but at a certain point in time, it is likely that, you know, you may not wind up working with somebody or may not work with them as frequently. And so you do want to a little bit think about some of those things in advance before you have a problem. You know, it's easy to kind of say, hey, you know, I don't think this is going to come up or blah, blah, blah. But, you know, and I'll give you just sort of a very simple example to kind of illustrate it, right? Like, it's common in contracts that people will fight about where you have your litigation, right? And let's say I'm doing a deal with Tencent. And if Tencent wants me to fly to Hong Kong to litigate my case, you know what, it's a lot less likely that I'm going to litigate my case than if it's here in Atlanta, Georgia, right? And it's easy to go, you know what, that's not really going to kind of come up. But at the point when it does, people aren't necessarily going to be reasonable. At the point that you are now having that fight, you know, if you're actually in litigation, nobody's going to bend over and be like, oh, that's great. Yeah, okay, we'll come to Atlanta now. You don't need to come to Hong Kong anymore. So you do want to be a little bit mindful, I think, of trying to protect yourself. But at the same time, I want to say that a lot of lawyers in particular, you know, I think will sometimes sort of rush to, you know, looking for legal solutions to problems. And I think that one of the most important things you want to be doing when you are having an issue with an independent contractor, whether it's a full-blown company or whether it's an individual, you know, think about your solutions inside the relationship, right? And part of that is kind of like thinking about, you know, like you said, like think about it from their perspective, right? I mean, why were they late on something, right? Were we late in telling them what our issues were with the last work product, right? So that they didn't have time to kind of like fix it on the next one or things like that. And I think that you want to own your own failures in that sort of way, right? And, you know, I know when I have a lot of conversations with people, I like to try and, you know, do this, whether it's an employee that I'm giving a review to or whether it's, you know, a independent contractor that we use. You know, I try and always throw in the phrase, what can we do to help you do better here? And when you have an ongoing relationship, you've got a lot of options, right? I mean, you can do, you know, make good things, right? They screwed something up, they're going to fix it, and maybe they have to give you the next one free or whatever, right? Whereas once you break that relationship, you know, it's a lot harder because you don't have as many options, right? Now every dollar that they pay you is a dollar they lose. There's less ways to sort of do something that's creative that works for everybody.
With employees, and I sort of did a video about this, but always make sure that you have a real cause if you're going to let go of an employee. But with that said, fire early, because I have definitely seen a lot of companies where there's somebody toxic who's dragging the entire team down, and because nobody wants to fire them, because firing's a hassle, instead, eventually they're going to have to get fired, and everybody realizes this, but they're there for 8 months, a year longer than they should be, and it destroys products and it destroys teams. So don't be afraid when you know you need to just make that decision.
Hey there. I feel like my question might be a little bit simpler, so hopefully this isn't a stupid question, but at what point in somebody's career or in somebody's life do you think it's either wise or like safe to start a company? And I know that some of this was kind of answered with previous questions, but I was hoping that I could hear some experiences from you all.
So I think that Molly and I have both started companies within the last 5 years, but I'll let Molly go first.
It's never safe, and you're never ready.
Okay.
No, but I am serious about that, because like I was like, oh, should I wait? And then I'm like, but I want to have kids someday, and I want to have control over my own schedule and all these things I wanted. And I was just like, I want to do it now. I'm just gonna do it. And sometimes you'll wait till, I'm gonna wait till I get fired, or a lot of people will like, now I'm gonna create my business because I just got fired, which is not a great time to create a business. You may have savings, but like if you want to make a business, it should be because you want to make a business, not because you're pissed off at your boss who fired you. Like, you should want to do this. I think at least 3 years before you do it. It's like, I would not create a business the moment you think about creating a business, if that makes sense. Don't impulse create one, because it is a long-term investment. There's so many people you're going to bring along with you on the ride who are going to be dependent on you. There's going to be people you're dependent on, and you just don't want to put yourself through that emotionally. A lot of people who go into startups end up with depression. I'm serious. And you have to do this because you really want to do this. Yeah. And there's not going to be a good time, unfortunately. I think that's just kind of dependent on who you are.
Yeah, so I think she's right. I think there's no good time, right? It's like having a kid, right? Like, I'm serious. Like, your business is like a kid. I have a child. I love him very much. But there's no right good time to do that. Like, it's gonna be a drain on you. It's gonna be expensive, and it's gonna be hard. And so you have to really want it. Like, you shouldn't have kids unless you really want kids, right? But so I think Molly's absolutely right. I think knowing in advance that you want to do it, start planning your business now, even if you go work for someone else for 10 years, right? And that way, 10 years from now, you've got a business plan that you've been working and tweaking and changing based on mistakes you see other people make for 10 years.
One quick follow-up on that. Like, yeah. What would you say that somebody who wants to start a company or a business, what kind of things do you think aren't commonly understood that they should be able to understand before starting? If you have any tips.
Yeah. Balance sheets. It sounds boring, but like if you can't read simple financial statements, okay. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think I would say a little bit of financial literacy certainly is very important. I would also throw out what is your business plan? And I mean, there's a lot of great ideas that aren't necessarily a business, right? They're not necessarily a product that somebody wants to buy. And that might be fine if what you're really looking to do is a side hobby or a side project. But at the end of the day, if what you really want is a business, you're going to need a product or a service that somebody wants to buy from you. And so thinking about, who your relevant customers are, right? And that may be, if you're going to be doing, co-dev work, right? That might be, the other developers that you're working with, right? If you are going to be a developer, a publisher, that may be, who are my target audience of players. But thinking about that and thinking about realistically things like the spread between how much your user acquisition cost is versus what's the lifetime value of those users, right? Because the one needs to be greater than the other, or you're just not going to unfortunately be a successful business. You'll be one of those businesses that Brandon was talking about before that he keeps shutting down.
And then so once you've done all that planning, like the time to pull the trigger and actually go out and do it, I think is just, to Molly's point, it's when you feel like you can't not do it, right? It has to be an internal decision. Like, it has to be that you just are so driven to do this that you have to pull the trigger.
I think we'd be lying if we said that there wasn't like a turning point that made that. Yeah. But it definitely, it's not always, it can't be a 100% impulse.
Yeah. So I don't know, do you want to talk, what was your turning point?
Not publicly, no.
Okay. Right.
I had a good job. I just wasn't on the same philosophy.
So I'll tell you, my turning point when I opened my own law firm, I left a law firm. I had a good job. I had salary. I had benefits. I had bosses who liked me, and I liked them. But my turning point was about 6 months before I ended up actually doing it. And I started really, like, having a plan and then having a plan you can implement are two different things. So I started really tweaking the plan to implement it about 6 months before I pulled the trigger. And the turning point for me was that I was at work one night, and I was there at like 7 o'clock, and I knew I had something I had to get done by the next morning because I was the 5th or 6th person on a very large transaction, and it had to get done by the next day so the transaction could close. I was the only one in the office, and my kid was going to his first swim class, and I couldn't go. And that, for me, I went, I'm out. I gotta fix this. So there will probably be a point, but it's still got to be an internal motivator.
I'll simplify mine. I was told I couldn't do something, and that I knew I could do, and then I went out and proved I could do it. That's pretty much. I don't like being told I can't do something.
Yeah, proving someone wrong is a very
It's
powerful.
really good. I'm on a big scale.
Well, thank you.
Yep.
This question is for the developers. I know y'all was talking about earlier about toxic relationship with the, I guess the customers of the video game that you develop. Looking at Fortnite, you know, they always get their feedback, and it's a multi-million-dollar game, as everybody knows, and it's been produced by Epic Games. Epic Games made Paragon. Paragon got shut down because they dropped it as a hat. They didn't listen to the community, but they came out with Fortnite and became more successful than Paragon. And for those that are hardcore in Paragon, I know some of you probably missed it like I do, but they also made Gears of War, of course, but then you also have Destiny. Destiny's made by Bungie. Destiny listened to their community. Some of them are kids that don't know what they're talking about. And then when they came out with Destiny 2, then it kind of failed. Then 78% of the players went to Warframe. So everybody loves Warframe because everything that it comes with, DLC all free. But when it comes to those type of toxic environments or just the community of listening to them, how do you know when to draw the line? And also, how do you know when to scrap the game and then come out with something new, which is really a gamble?
Well, I have one piece of advice when listening to the community. I mean, when the community is raging, don't listen to them. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly gotten a lot of death threats, right? And I'm really not going to listen to any of the advice that you begin with, I'm going to kill you and your family. By the way, here's how you should change your game. But the one thing I would say is when you are listening to community, another part of the customer not always being right, but us listening to them, is we need to really dig into why, right? Why they're saying something, because very often it's a very human tendency to leap to a solution. And when the consumer offers a solution, what we as developers need to do is not take that solution. We need to figure out why they were offering that solution, what problem they were trying to solve, and then find what the best solution for that problem is ourselves. Sometimes it will be the solution they offered, but a lot of the times, because we know the game, we know the development, there will be some other answer to that same problem that's more correct.
I don't want to talk about death threats. Yeah, I mean, this goes back to listening for sure. In terms of listening to consumers, I can't talk about what it's like to run a big company because I've never worked for a giant company, and I don't want to. That's just not something that I've ever wanted to do. So I think those problems are obviously a lot more massive. But even just on a small scale, we try to, that consumer has one perspective. Right. They may be the player that's played X many hours in the game, but you may have other players over here who are more casual and you want to support them. And so you have to find the happy medium to support different players, and you try to support the different personality types as much as you can, or the gameplay personality types as you can, often with the problems. But if they give you death threats, that's just a no thing for me. It's just ban that person and just be on with it. And I mean, I'm not the best example. I've done things like screenshot reviews and been like, this person said they wouldn't play our game because it has a prince you have to rescue in it, and just put it on Twitter, which is not, don't do that. Not the right thing to do. Maybe, I don't know.
I actually think that's positive.
Yeah, definitely don't put it on Twitter like with their personal home address.
Yeah, don't off them.
Right.
But they made it public. Oh, they took the review down too after they did that. So I guess,
it worked.
Maybe.
I also love those reviews on Steam that you get where it's 750 hours played, this game is terrible.
I don't think at a big company you should probably do that. You should probably get fired. But I run my own business, so.
I guess it goes back to what you were saying earlier, handling things gracefully. So
Handle it gracefully. And Epic is an interesting case study, actually, because they've had a lot of games that haven't done well. But they've had one game that did so well that none of those matter anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's the reason why I mentioned that it was a big gamble. Unlike like what you were saying earlier, like Warframe is actually a community-based game because it's been out for 5 years and they always listen to the community. So every content and DLC that came out was based off the community's, observance for the game because nobody didn't think that game was going to be where it is right now.
And they're also really good, though, at that why, right? Like, all the time their community asks for more things to be free. And rather than that, they've tuned their economy in such a way so that way the players can get at least a modicum of what they want through the play itself. But they haven't actually gone that route of, okay, everything's free now, 100%. But they know what stuff they can give away, like all the DLC that you're talking about, that really matters to the player. And so I think they do also a really good job of figuring out, okay, what's the player really asking for? What problem are they trying to solve here?
Yeah, and actually, I think that's the number one answer that we've heard on this panel, is don't listen directly to what they're saying, figure out why they're saying it, right? I heard one of the community managers for Insomniac on a panel, and he said that people consistently were complaining about the way one of the weapons in one of their games worked. And it wasn't because, the problem was not actually the way that weapon worked. The problem was that the way it balanced with all of the other things. So by not changing that weapon at all, by shifting like 10 other things in the game, they solved that problem. But they never changed the thing that was asked to be changed. And so yeah, getting to the why I think is important.
All right, thank you guys.
Hello again. My name's Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Brian.
Hi, buddy. I actually wanted to talk more on the side of legal stuff because I've heard a lot about game talks and I watch a lot of game stuff online, such as not just with James Portnow, but also seen some stuff with like Jesse Scale and many other game designers who have affected the game industry over time. But I wanted to talk more on how do you hire the right lawyer or the right legal person to.
So I pitched this like literally your question I pitched as a panel to GDC 3 years in a row, and every year they haven't taken it. And I think it's because they think I'm trying to sell myself. But my idea is actually not to put me even on that panel. Like, I want to hear other people who've hired lawyers answer that question.
It's just a really hard question just because of like, this isn't something they teach us in school or anything. This is something completely to the left.
So
I
would say that like the lawyer answer is going to be look at their qualifications, but I would defer to these two actually to answer that question.
My answer is so bad though. My lawyer, before I got into the games industry, I was in the music industry and saw the U.S. in a rock band, right? And so my lawyer is actually my old attorney from those days, and it's because the other bands he represented were cool. I believe he represented the hardest core punk bands in Seattle, and that's how you should determine what lawyer.
All right, so this is a point of privilege. Our first lawyer was actually my family's lawyer, but it wasn't a good match because this lawyer was more, my family's in the music industry, was more in the music industry, and they didn't know anything about games or even really technology. So I noticed I knew enough about MySpace when I was reading the contracts. I was like, there's just stuff that's not in here about data that needs to be in here. And so I went looking elsewhere, and I met Brandon, and he was great. And he's now our lawyer. The story.
So actually, you probably do hire outside counsel.
I do.
So how do you look into that, and how do you make that decision?
So as in-house counsel, I do hire a lot of outside attorneys. It is different. It's different at different scales, right? So I mean, we're a pretty decent sized company. We have 400 people, and I have lots of attorneys outside of the company that I work with. And I guess sort of as a microcosm of kind of what you're talking about, I forget which of the two you actually said it now, but you do want to have somebody who knows about the specific thing that you're talking about, right? And I don't know if it's because video games are cool or what, but there are a lot of people that are in the video game space, like in the video game space, that they don't really seem to know a whole lot about video games, right? And there definitely are, as with anything, I mean, this isn't just a lawyer-specific thing, right? I mean, you could say this about countless fields, right? That if somebody is just, they're a generalist, I mean, would you really want your family doctor to perform surgery on your heart? Of course not, right? Like, you want somebody that actually knows about the actual area that they're working with. But at the same time, I would also say, one of the biggest things I would say is be direct. I mean, this is a service provider to you, right? And realize that, you have the power, not them, right? Like, you are their client. I mean, if you are not happy with your lawyer, go get a different one. I mean, talk with them, right? I'm not saying like, just never return their phone call or whatever. I mean, it's entirely possible that, there's a misunderstanding between you guys and communication, et cetera. You can, address whatever the problems you're having are. But, if your attorney is talking to you like, you don't know what you're talking about, and if they're talking down to you, et cetera, that's probably not the attorney that I want, right? I mean, an attorney, first and foremost, hopefully, I think one of the most important things for them, they should be a good communicator, right? They should be able to explain to you why they're doing what they're doing. They should be able to explain to you why it costs as much as it does, right? In an ideal scenario, they'll be able to tell you in advance how much something will cost, but I mean, that can be complicated. It's tough to know what all is going to happen, right? But if they, if they're sort of doing things for you and you're kind of asking them why, and they can't really explain that to you, I mean, that would certainly be a big concern to me. And so I think that, I understand that you're in charge of the relationship, that you can go find somebody else. Even in the video game space, where it is a pretty small video game bar, there are other attorneys. There are attorneys at different price points. So hopefully, there's somebody. And if you're asking for any reason, because, for example, maybe you're looking for somebody, I'm sure, both Brandon and myself would be happy to, make suggestions to people we may know.
Also ask some questions about how would we educate ourselves on knowing which ones is the right lawyer to choose?
So, it is tough, and the right one for you may not be the right one for somebody else. The right one for your company might not be the right one for another company. But you do want somebody. One thing I will say: people that don't work in that space, they may be able to still do something right, okay? But it may take them a lot longer, right? And I think that people do sometimes get a little bit too focused on what is the rate that I'm paying my attorney, right? Am I paying this person whatever, $200 an hour, and maybe there's somebody that I can pay $100 an hour, or maybe there's somebody that is going to charge $700 an hour or $1,000 an hour. Like, don't worry about the numbers. The point is, if they're taking forever to do it because they're not in that space, it could be more expensive than finding somebody who works in that space, even if they're charging a little bit more from an hourly standpoint. But again, I think you definitely want somebody that you feel comfortable with, and talk to people. Yeah. They'll tell you who they like and why. I think people you'll find.
I would say, like when I'm consulting with a new potential client, the question that I always hope that they will ask is for a reference. Because if I can't give you a reference of someone else in the same industry that will say something nice about me, that's not a good sign, right? But I can give you lots of them. So I'm hoping they ask that question, and very few ever do, actually. But yeah, so ask for references, I would say.
Okay.
And just one other thing about sort of what you were saying, because I think everybody is very right here. I stuck with an attorney who actually didn't know much about the game space, and we had to sneak him into lots of conventions, and he was willing to learn a great deal, which was awesome. But the reason that we stuck with him is because, at least for me, what I'm looking for in an attorney is not just someone who is simply a legal service provider, but counsel, right? And there are lots of times where we've been on the verge of major business decisions, and we've turned to our lawyer and said, hey, you're an outside perspective, you're a perspective we trust. We know we can trust you completely because of our relationship with you being our lawyer. From both a legal and from a larger perspective, what are your thoughts on this business decision? And that's been invaluable to us. That's been more valuable in some ways than the technical legal skills. And so that may just be my experience, but to me, that's also something I'm looking for, counsel as much as attorney.
If I talk more on the subject afterwards. Or...
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
All right, so the question I know is really on everybody's mind. Which of you is worth the most experience in a boss battle? Come on, fess up. Oh, okay, Molly. Molly wins. All right, thank you all very much. Great panel. Awesome information. Brandon, James, Molly, Nate, thank you all very much. And if you want more of this perspective from a whole different vantage point, the rants are at 8 o'clock, and now you'll get the inside stories, everything they've been talking about.
And at 9:30 here, quite possibly, although possibly not, we are going to grab some designers and hang out and play spooky games and analyze them, do a design analysis. So if you ever want to know how to play as a designer, come hang out here for a wonderful Saturday night fright.
There you go. All right, so go grab dinner now because there's a lot more tonight. Rants at 8.